Imagine a conflict that spanned 200 years, a brutal, epic struggle that completely reshaped the world and left behind a legacy that, honestly, we're still grappling with today. We're talking about the Crusades. So what were they really, and why do they still matter so much?
So what were they exactly? Well, it's not simple. They were part military campaign, part holy war, and part armed pilgrimage. For 2 centuries, they pitted the Christians of Western Europe against the great Muslim powers of the Middle East. And to really get our heads around this, we have to go right back to the beginning.
All right, so let's set the stage. This whole thing didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It all started in the 11th century, a world that was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
I mean, just try to picture what was going on back then. First, Christianity itself is split right down the middle between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East. Then, the Byzantine Empire, which was kind of seen as the Eastern shield of Christianity, gets hit with a devastating defeat. So you've got this desperate Byzantine emperor asking Rome for help, and Pope Urban II, he sees a massive opportunity, not just to lend a hand, but to maybe reunite Christianity, bring Europe's brawling knights under his command, and point all that violent energy at a common enemy.
So when Pope Urban gets up and finishes this incredible speech, promising that your sins would be forgiven if you fought to take back Jerusalem, this was the response from the crowd. Deus vult, God wills it. I mean, can you imagine the energy? That one phrase became this incredible rallying cry that just lit a fire across Europe.
And what's really interesting is the language they used. The people who went on the first one didn't even call it a crusade. To them, it was an iter, a journey, a pilgrimage. The term crucignati, or those signed with the cross, came later. It perfectly shows what this was, a strange, powerful mix of a holy journey and a holy war.
Okay, so you've got this incredible religious fire sweeping Europe, but how do you turn that into an actual army on the move? Well, the first attempt, let's just say it was not what the Pope had in mind.
Before the real armies even got their boots on, this massive, chaotic wave of ordinary people, peasants, and townfolk just took off for the Holy Land. It was called the People's Crusade, and, well, it was a disaster. They were wiped out almost immediately. But right behind them came the Prince's Crusade, and this was the real deal. Organized, professional armies led by Europe's top nobles. This was the force that was about to change everything.
After this incredibly tough 3-year journey, they finally made it to Jerusalem. And the siege that followed was just unbelievably brutal. When the city walls were finally breached, the Crusaders poured in, and for 2 days, they slaughtered thousands of the city's Muslim and Jewish men, women, and children. It was a shocking victory and an act of violence that would echo for centuries.
And here's the real kicker. They didn't just raid and leave. They were there to stay. They set up 4 brand new states right in the middle of the region, an entirely new society called Outremer, which literally means the land beyond the sea.
So they've built these kingdoms. Job done, right? Not even close. Creating them was one thing, but holding on to them, that turned into a constant bloody struggle for the next 100 years.
You see, a big reason the First Crusade actually worked was because the Muslim world was totally divided at the time. But that was all about to change. A new, brilliant leader named Saladin came to power. He managed to unite Egypt and Syria, building a massive empire that had one central goal: to take back Jerusalem.
And this brings us to the Battle of Hattin in 1187. This was an absolute game changer. Saladin brilliantly trapped the main Crusader army in the desert with no water and just annihilated it. The military backbone of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was snapped in a single day, and just a few months later, Saladin and his army walked into Jerusalem itself.
Losing Jerusalem? That sent shockwaves through Europe. The response was huge, the Third Crusade, basically the Avengers of its day, led by Europe's most famous kings, like Richard the Lionheart. What followed was this legendary showdown between Richard and Saladin. In the end, Richard couldn't retake Jerusalem, but he did manage to save a small strip of the kingdom along the coast. They ended up signing a truce, a hard-fought compromise.
You'd think after that epic clash of kings, things might have settled down. But actually, this is where the whole crusading idea really starts to go off the rails. The dream was about to unravel. Okay, get this. The Fourth Crusade is maybe the most bonkers story in this whole saga. The plan was to attack Egypt, the real heart of Muslim power. But the Crusaders showed up and they couldn't pay the Venetians for the ships they'd booked. So, to pay off their debt, they agreed to attack another Christian city for the Venetians,
And from there, it just spiraled, until this Christian army, on a holy war, ended up attacking and brutally sacking the biggest Christian city on earth, Constantinople. I mean, the sheer brutality of it was just off the charts. This quote from a historian who was there at the time says it all. He points out the crazy irony that Saladin, the infidel, had been more merciful in Jerusalem than these so-called holy warriors were to their fellow Christians. It was a complete betrayal, and it shattered the relationship between the two halves of Christianity forever.
And just when you thought it couldn't get worse for the Crusader states, a new power enters the scene. And these guys were on a whole different level. They were the Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who took over Egypt. They were ruthless, disciplined, and had one all-consuming mission: to permanently kick the Crusaders out of their lands.
So the Mamluks, after proving they could even beat the Mongols, who nobody could beat, they turned their full attention on what was left of the Crusader states. And it was systematic. One by one, the cities and castles that had stood for generations fell. It all came to a dramatic end in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the very last Crusader stronghold. The 200-year-long project was officially over.
So, the Crusader kingdoms are gone, wiped off the map. End of story, right? Well, no. The kingdoms were gone, but the idea of the crusade, that was just getting started, and its echoes would be heard for centuries.
And this is what's so fascinating. The whole concept of a crusade, this holy war with heavenly rewards, sanctioned by the Pope, it turned out to be a really useful idea. It became a political tool used to justify wars against pagans in the north, against Muslims in Spain during the Reconquista, and even against other Christians in France who the church decided were heretics.
And believe it or not, this stuff is still being talked about and fought over today. In some political circles in the Muslim world, the Crusades are seen as chapter 1 of a long history of Western imperialism. And on the other side, some right-wing groups in the West have actually adopted Crusader symbols to frame today's political battles as a continuation of that same ancient conflict.
Which really brings us back to the central question, doesn't it? Were the Crusades a heroic quest of faith, or were they just a brutal colonial invasion? The truth is, it's complicated, and the fact that we're still arguing about it almost 1,000 years later just shows how deeply this story is still tangled up in our world today. How we remember it says just as much about us now as it does about the past.